A quiet dinner table. Plates clink, kids laugh, the TV hums in the background. Nothing feels unusual, nothing feels wrong. But behind the walls, something is about to snap. A scream cuts through the air. Footsteps pound down the hall. In seconds, the house turns from a home into a nightmare. Children running, parents pleading, doors slamming shut. And then, silence. Across the world, there have been nights like this. Nights when entire families were wiped out in brutal massacres that no one saw coming. Crimes so violent, they left police stunned, neighbors terrified, and communities broken forever. It began in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the smiles on the surface were hiding something no one could imagine. Chris Watts, Frederick, Colorado, August 13, 2018. A friend grew worried when 34-year-old Shanann Watts stopped answering calls. She was pregnant, raising 2 daughters, and had just returned home from a business trip. That morning, she missed a doctor's appointment. By the afternoon, police were at the house. Her purse was inside. Her phone was inside. The family car sat in the garage, car seats still strapped in place. But Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were nowhere to be found. Chris Watts, Shanann's husband, welcomed officers at the door. On the outside, he played the role of a calm, confused husband. To the public, he said all the right things, pleading for his family's safe return, asking anyone with information to come forward. But neighbors noticed his strange behavior. He was fidgety, distracted, almost detached. One later told police, something just didn't feel right. As detectives dug deeper, Chris's story began to crack. Security cameras showed him backing his truck into the garage early that morning, loading something inside. His timeline didn't make sense. His answers changed from one conversation to the next. Detectives asked him to take a polygraph. He agreed and failed. When the examiner told him there was no reason to keep lying, the mask slipped. At first, Chris tried to blame Shanann. He claimed she had hurt the children and that he killed her in a rage, but investigators pressed harder. Eventually, the truth came out. Chris had murdered Shanann in their bedroom, then driven his daughters, still alive, to a remote oil site where he worked. There he smothered them and hid their bodies in oil tanks. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave nearby. The motive was as cold as the crime itself. Chris was having an affair. He wanted a new life without the responsibilities of a wife and children. And for that, he erased them all. In November 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For many, it wasn't just the brutality that made the case infamous, it was the betrayal. The smiling husband in family photos was the same man who had destroyed them, a father who murdered the people who trusted him most. But Chris Watts was not the first to shatter the illusion of safety behind closed doors. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet Tokyo neighborhood, another family's life was stolen in a single night. An attack so violent, it left investigators haunted for decades. Setagaya Family Massacre, Tokyo, Japan, December 30th, 2000. In the Setagaya district, just west of the city center, the Miyazawa family was preparing for the new year. Mikio, his wife Yasuko, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Niina and 6-year-old Rei, lived in a quiet residential neighborhood right next to a park. Their home was modern, bright, and filled with the sounds of family life. But on that winter night, someone entered the house and turned it into a scene of horror. The killer broke in through a bathroom window. Once inside, he attacked with staggering violence. Mikio was stabbed in the head and neck. Yasuko and little Niina were found upstairs, both stabbed repeatedly. 6-year-old Rei, the youngest, was strangled in his bed. The brutality shocked investigators, not just because the family was wiped out, but because of what the killer did afterward. He didn't flee. Instead, he stayed inside the house. He ate their food, he drank tea, he used their computer. He even took a nap on the couch. Bloodied clothing, a knife, and other personal items were left scattered across the rooms. It was as if the murderer felt no urgency to leave. Forensics revealed disturbing clues. The killer had left behind fingerprints and DNA, suggesting he was of mixed Asian descent, possibly part Korean. His clothes were traced to a specific brand sold only in Japan, and investigators discovered sand in his belongings that likely came from a military base. Despite this mountain of evidence, no arrest was ever made. The case remains unsolved more than 2 decades later, and every year, Japanese police still revisit the crime scene, hoping to find the lead that has eluded them. For many, it stands as one of Japan's most haunting mysteries, a family wiped out in their own home by a killer who vanished into the night. But while this case left behind questions that may never be answered, others showed how easily a killer can blend back into everyday life, disappearing for years, even decades, before the truth finally came out. John List, Westfield, New Jersey, November 9, 1971. The mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue was quiet that morning. Inside lived John List, his wife Helen, their 3 children, and John's elderly mother. Outwardly, they seemed like a respectable suburban family. But beneath the surface, everything was unraveling. John List was a deeply religious man, obsessed with appearances. He worked as an accountant, but had recently lost his job. Bills piled up. His marriage was strained. Helen was an alcoholic, and the children were growing into independent young adults, pulling away from their father's rigid control. To John, the walls were closing in. That morning, he made a decision that would horrify the nation. He retrieved a handgun and a rifle. One by one, he murdered his family. He shot his wife Helen in the kitchen. He then shot his mother Alma in her upstairs apartment. When his teenage daughter Patricia and 16-year-old son Frederick returned from school, he killed them too. Later, he drove to watch his eldest son John Jr.'s soccer game, brought him home and shot him multiple times, so many that prosecutors later suggested the boy fought back. Afterward, List carefully placed the bodies of his wife and children in sleeping bags inside the ballroom. His mother's body remained upstairs. He cleaned up, ate lunch, and wrote a confession letter to his pastor, explaining that he had killed his family to save their souls from what he believed was the corruption of the world. Then he turned on the lights, turned down the thermostat, and vanished. The bodies weren't discovered for nearly a month. By then, John List had disappeared completely. He assumed a new identity, remarried, and lived quietly for almost 18 years. His face was forgotten until America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the case in 1989. A forensic sculptor created an age-progressed bust of List, showing what he might look like years later. The likeness was so accurate that neighbors in Virginia recognized him immediately. John List was arrested and convicted of 5 counts of murder. In court, he showed little remorse, still insisting he had acted out of religious duty. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 2008. The case shocked America not only for its brutality, but for the cold calculation, how a man could erase his family, disappear into society, and almost get away with it. But not every family annihilator managed to hide in plain sight. Some left scenes so bloody, so chaotic, that their crimes became infamous the very moment they were discovered. Bever Family Massacre, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, July 22, 2015. Just after 11:30 p.m., a frantic 911 call came from inside a quiet suburban home. The voice on the other end was a teenage girl begging for help before the line went dead. Moments later, police arrived to find a scene that would haunt even seasoned officers. Inside the house, blood was everywhere, on the walls, the floors, the stairs. 5 members of the Bever family had been stabbed to death. The attackers weren't intruders. They weren't strangers. They were 2 of the family's own sons, 18-year-old Robert and 16-year-old Michael. The brothers had been planning the massacre for months. Isolated from the outside world, obsessed with violence and online gore, they fantasized about killing their family and then going on a nationwide spree. Their plan was meticulous: knives, gear, even attempts to cut the home's phone line. But what unfolded was a frenzy of brutality. Their parents were among the first victims. Then came their younger siblings. By the time the attack was over, 5 lives were gone, including children as young as 5 years old. One sister, gravely wounded, managed to escape and call for help. Her survival and testimony exposed the brothers' chilling plan in full detail. When arrested, Robert showed no remorse. He boasted to detectives about the killings, speaking with a calm detachment that unnerved even experienced investigators. Michael was quieter, but equally complicit. In court, the brothers faced the reality of their crimes. Robert received multiple life sentences without parole. Michael, tried as an adult, also received a life sentence. The Bever home was eventually demolished. But for the community, the memory of that night lingers. The realization that two teenagers had turned their own home into a slaughterhouse. Unlike John List, who tried to justify his crimes with religion, the Bevers offered no such explanation. Their motive was pure destruction, killing for the sake of killing. But not all family massacres are carried out by teenagers chasing twisted fantasies. Some are committed by men who build quiet lives, only to unleash unimaginable violence on those closest to them. Ronald Gene Simmons, Russellville, Arkansas, December 1987. Neighbors noticed the Simmons family hadn't been seen in days. Their home, a makeshift residence in the woods, pieced together from scrap lumber and metal, looked quiet, almost abandoned. But inside, Ronald Gene Simmons had carried out one of the deadliest family massacres in American history. It began a few days before Christmas. One by one, Simmons lured his family members into the house. He strangled his son and grandson, then shot his wife and two of his children. Their bodies were hidden in the backyard. When more relatives arrived for the holiday, he murdered them too, shooting and strangling as each walked through the door. By the time it was over, 14 members of the Simmons family were dead. His wife, his children, and even his grandchildren. The killings were methodical, deliberate, carried out with chilling patience. For days afterward, Simmons lived in the house among the corpses, drinking beer and watching television as if nothing had happened. But his rampage wasn't finished. A week later, Simmons walked into his former workplace in Russellville carrying a handgun. He opened fire on his supervisors and co-workers, killing 2 and wounding several more before finally surrendering to police. The scale of his crimes shocked the nation. In total, Ronald Gene Simmons murdered 16 people, making it one of the worst family massacres in U.S. history. He showed no remorse, and in court, he even refused to appeal his death sentence. In 1990, he was executed by lethal injection. The Simmons case stood out not just for the number of victims, but for the coldness of the killer, a man who exterminated his entire bloodline, then kept killing until someone stopped him. But while Simmons's rampage was fueled by years of rage and control, another family massacre on the other side of the world left investigators grappling with questions of motive that were far less clear. Lynn family murders, Epping, Sydney, Australia, July 18, 2009. The Lynn family ran a small, successful news agency in a quiet Sydney suburb. They were well-liked, hard-working, and close-knit. But that winter morning, the shop never opened. Customers grew suspicious. Calls went unanswered. When relatives went to check the family's home, they discovered a crime scene so brutal that even veteran police officers were shaken. 5 members of the family had been beaten to death in their sleep. The victims included Min Lin and his wife Yun Lin, their 2 young sons, and Yun's sister. Only one person survived the attack, Kathy Lin, Min's sister-in-law, because she had been staying elsewhere that night. The weapon was a hammer-like object, used with savage force. Investigators described the house as drenched in blood. Whoever committed the crime had moved carefully, targeting each victim in their bed to ensure no one could escape. Suspicion eventually fell on Kathy's husband, Robert Tsai, Min Lin's brother-in-law. At first, he appeared to grieve with the family, attending memorials and offering support. But police uncovered a web of resentment. Robert was jealous of Min's success and standing in the Chinese-Australian community. Financial struggles and personal grudges had turned to rage. The investigation dragged on for years, with DNA evidence eventually tying Robert C. to the crime. After 4 trials in 2017, he was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Lin family murders shocked Australia not only for their brutality, but for their intimacy. A man wiping out his own extended family, motivated by envy and bitterness. But family massacres don't always come from jealousy or resentment. Sometimes they erupt in ways that seem almost random, their brutality amplified by the legends that grow around them. And nowhere is that truer than in one of America's most infamous cases, the Amityville murders. Ronald DeFeo Jr., Amityville murders, Amityville, New York, November 13th, 1974. At 3 a.m., a series of gunshots echoed through a large Dutch colonial house on Ocean Avenue. Inside lived the DeFeo family, Ronald and Louise DeFeo, and their 5 children. By sunrise, all but one of them were dead. The only survivor was the eldest son, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. Known as Butch, he had long been at odds with his parents. That night, armed with a .35 caliber rifle, he shot them both as they slept. Then he turned the weapon on his 2 brothers and 2 sisters, each killed in their beds. When police arrived, DeFeo claimed the murders were the work of a mob hitman. But inconsistencies in his story unraveled quickly. Within days, he confessed, he alone had pulled the trigger. His motive, prosecutors argued, was a toxic mix of resentment, drug use, and years of tension in the home. The brutality of the crime stunned Long Island. 6 family members dead in their own house, murdered by the son they had raised. In court, DeFeo's defense argued insanity, claiming he heard voices that drove him to kill. The jury rejected it. In 1975, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. But the story of the Amityville murders didn't end there. A year later, a new family moved into the house and claimed to experience terrifying paranormal activity. Stories of voices, visions, and unexplained forces. Their account became the basis for books and films that turned the Amityville house into one of the most famous haunted locations in the world. Yet behind the legends and Hollywood adaptations, the reality remains stark. 6 people lost their lives that night, murdered in their sleep by someone they trusted. And while Amityville became infamous for the myths it inspired, another family massacre decades later would stand out for something very different: the sheer scale of violence spread across multiple homes in a single community. Pike County Roden Family Massacre, Pike County, Ohio, April 22, 2016. In the early hours of the morning, 8 members of the Roden family were murdered across 4 different homes. The killings were precise, targeted, and carried out almost simultaneously. When police arrived, the scale of the massacre became clear. It wasn't a random act of violence, it was an execution. The victims ranged in age from teenagers to middle-aged adults. Some were shot as they slept, others were ambushed in their doorways. 3 young children were found alive, spared, but left to grow up with the memory of what they had lost. At first, investigators had few answers. Rumors swirled about drugs, money, and family feuds. But the truth was more personal. Years later, it was revealed that the murders were carried out by another local family, the Wagners. Their motive, a bitter custody dispute over a child born between the 2 families. The Wagners believed killing the Rodens would give them control. The plot was chilling in its detail. The killers used silencers. They cut off security cameras. They moved quickly between the different homes to ensure no one had time to escape. It was one of the largest homicide investigations in Ohio's history. In 2018, 4 members of the Wagner family were arrested and charged with the murders. Over time, they admitted their roles. In 2022 and 2023, guilty pleas and trials brought life sentences for the killers, ensuring none of them would walk free again. The Roden massacre left an entire community shaken, not just for the number of victims, but for the planning and coldness behind it. Whole branches of a family tree were wiped out in a single night, leaving behind children who would grow up with scars no sentence could erase. But while the Pike County case was calculated and deliberate, some family massacres strike with shocking intimacy. Murders that unfold inside the very walls of a family's apartment, carried out by someone who was supposed to protect. Crim family murders. Manhattan, New York, October 25, 2012. The Crim family lived in an upscale apartment building on the Upper West Side. Kevin and Marina Crim were raising 3 young children, Lulu, age 6, Leo, age 2, and Nessie, who was just a baby. Like many parents in the city, they relied on a trusted nanny to help care for the kids. That evening, Marina returned home with Nessie after taking her to a swimming lesson. The apartment was unusually quiet. As she walked through the rooms, she noticed the lights were off. Then, in the bathroom, she discovered a nightmare. Her two oldest children, Lulu and Leo, had been stabbed to death in the bathtub. Standing over them was their nanny, Yoselin Ortega, covered in blood, a knife still in her hands. Moments later, Ortega turned the blade on herself, but survived. The crime shocked New York. Ortega had been with the family for years, trusted to care for the children every day. There had been no clear warning signs, only quiet frustrations about money, hours, and resentment toward her employers. But the rage she unleashed that evening was devastating. Marina's screams echoed through the building. Neighbors rushed to help as police and paramedics flooded the apartment. Kevin, the children's father, returned home minutes later to find the street blocked by flashing lights and chaos. In an instant, the family's world had been destroyed. The case went to trial years later. Ortega's defense claimed mental illness, arguing she was not responsible for her actions. But prosecutors pointed to the planning, the deliberate way she had waited until Marina was out, the brutality of the stabbings, the attempt to kill herself afterward. The jury agreed. In 2018, Ortega was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Krim family murders remain one of New York's most disturbing crimes. A family torn apart not by an outsider, but by someone they had welcomed into their home, trusted with their children, and treated as part of their lives. But not all family massacres happen in city apartments. Some take place in quiet rural homes, carried out by armed men in sudden waves of violence, and in one Georgia farmhouse in 1973, an entire family faced such an attack. All-Day Family Murders, Donaldsonville, Georgia, May 14, 1973. The All-Day family lived in a quiet farmhouse, working the land as generations before them had. But on that spring afternoon, violence came crashing through their door in the form of 6 escaped convicts on the run from a prison work camp. The men, hardened criminals already serving time for robbery and assault, were armed and desperate. When they stumbled upon the All-Day home, they decided to take what they wanted: money, guns, and dominance. What followed was one of the most infamous crimes in Georgia's history. One by one, members of the All-Day family arrived at the farmhouse and were ambushed. Ned All-Day, the patriarch, was the first to be killed. His sons and brothers followed. By the time the spree ended, 6 members of the All-Day family lay dead, shot at close range. The only survivor in the house was Mary All-Day, who was abducted, assaulted, and then murdered in a wooded area nearby. The brutality shocked the small rural community. Families in Donaldsonville had long left their doors unlocked, but after that day, trust was gone. The sheer randomness of the attack, that the All-Days were targeted simply because they were home when the killers came, made it even more terrifying. The manhunt was massive. Within days, authorities captured the escapees. Their trials were swift and 4 of the men were sentenced to death. The case dragged through appeals for years, but the verdict stood as a reminder of how quickly an ordinary family could be destroyed by outsiders with nothing to lose. The All-Day family murders left a permanent scar on rural Georgia. The farmhouse was eventually abandoned, a grim reminder of the massacre that had taken place inside. But decades later, another family massacre would unfold in a very different setting. Not in a farmhouse, but in a modern suburban home in Richmond, Virginia, where a seemingly normal visit ended in unspeakable violence. Richmond Massacre, Richmond, Virginia, January 1, 2006. The Harvey family was well known in the city. Brian and Catherine Harvey were musicians, creative and kind, raising 2 daughters, Stella, age 9, and Ruby, just 4. On New Year's Day, relatives expected them at a family gathering. When they didn't arrive, relatives went to check their home. What they found inside was pure horror. The entire Harvey family had been bound, beaten, and murdered. The killers were Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge, 2 ex-convicts who had chosen the Harveys' home at random while prowling the neighborhood. What began as a burglary quickly escalated into something far darker. Gray and Dandridge tied up Brian, Catherine, and the two little girls. For hours, they terrorized the family before setting the house on fire in an attempt to cover their tracks. But even in death, the brutality was clear. The Harveys had been stabbed and bludgeoned, the children murdered alongside their parents. The crime shocked Richmond. The Harvey family was beloved in the community, and the senselessness of the murders sent ripples of fear through the city. Who could do this and why? Within days, Gray and Dandridge were arrested. Investigators linked them to a series of home invasions and murders in the area, but the Harvey case stood out for its sheer cruelty. In court, Gray admitted to the killings and showed little remorse. He was sentenced to death and executed in 2017. Dandridge received life in prison. For Richmond, the murders were a nightmare that shattered the sense of safety in even the most ordinary homes. The Harveys had done nothing to make themselves targets. They were simply chosen. But while the Harvey massacre began as a random home invasion, other family murders have been rooted in long-standing disputes, grudges and rivalries that exploded into violence, leaving entire households destroyed. And in Mexico, one such feud turned into a bloodbath that would claim multiple lives in a single night. Del Castillo Family Massacre, Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. June 2013. The Del Castillo family lived in a modest home on the outskirts of Juarez, a city already scarred by cartel violence and turf wars. But even in a place accustomed to headlines of murder, what happened inside their house that night shocked the community. Armed men forced their way in, moving room to room with ruthless efficiency. When the gunfire stopped, 9 members of the Del Castillo family were dead. Parents, children, and relatives who had gathered under one roof. The killers left no chance of survival, ensuring every witness was silenced. The motive pointed back to cartel rivalries. Investigators believed the family had been targeted because of suspected connections to rival factions. Whether those connections were real or imagined didn't matter. In Juarez at the time, accusations alone were enough to sign a death warrant. Neighbors recalled the sounds of rapid gunfire piercing the night. By the time police arrived, the killers were long gone, leaving only devastation behind. The house was riddled with bullet holes, blood pooling on the floors. Survivors from nearby homes described the scene as something out of a war zone. For Juarez, already labeled the murder capital of the world, the Del Castillo massacre underscored the human cost of cartel violence. Entire families erased in a single night, their deaths reduced to statistics in an endless cycle of revenge. Unlike the Harvey murders in Richmond, where killers struck at random, the Del Castillo case was calculated, rooted in power and intimidation. But sometimes family massacres are driven not by gangs or revenge, but by the twisted mind of a single individual acting alone. And in England, one such man became known as the crossbow cannibal, a killer who lured his victims into his apartment and shocked the world with his confession. Stephen Griffiths, Bradford, England, 2010. Stephen Griffiths was a postgraduate student studying criminology. On paper, he appeared quiet, intelligent, even academic. But behind closed doors, he nurtured a fascination with serial killers and violent crime, obsessions that would soon turn deadly. Griffiths lived in a converted block of flats, where neighbors thought of him as eccentric but harmless. That illusion ended when CCTV cameras in the building captured something shocking. The footage showed Griffiths attacking a woman in the hallway. Armed with a crossbow, he shot her at close range, then dragged her body back into his apartment. It was only the beginning. Police later uncovered that Griffiths had murdered at least 3 women, Suzanne Blamiers, Shelley Armitage, and Susan Rushworth, all vulnerable victims lured into his trap. Inside his flat, investigators found books on serial killers, chilling notes and evidence of his crimes. He called himself the Crossbow Cannibal, a name that horrified the press and cemented his infamy. Griffiths confessed during his trial, showing little emotion. He claimed his killings were the culmination of years of violent fantasies, and he reveled in the attention. In 2010, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. The case shocked Britain not only for the brutality of the murders, but for Griffiths' arrogance, his willingness to name himself, to pose as if he were the subject of his own dark study. But Griffiths' killings were those of an individual predator. Family massacres are often different, rooted in rage, desperation, or collapse within the home itself. And in one case in New Zealand, a man would wipe out nearly his entire family, leaving the country reeling from the scale of the slaughter. Newland Family Murders, Masterton, New Zealand. June 1992. The Newland family was known in their small town as ordinary, hard-working people. But inside their home, a storm was building, one centered on 52-year-old Brian Schlepfer. To neighbors, he seemed quiet, even respectable. To his family, he was unpredictable, brooding, and angry. On the morning of June 8th, Schlepfer snapped. Armed with a shotgun, he moved through the family home with cold precision. His wife, Jocelyn, was among the first victims. Then he turned the weapon on his sons, their partners, and even his grandchildren. 7 members of the family were gunned down before it was over. The violence was relentless. Survivors later described moments of terror as shots rang out, family members trying desperately to escape, only to be caught by the man who was supposed to protect them. The massacre ended only when Schlepfer turned the gun on himself. For New Zealand, the crime was almost incomprehensible. It was one of the deadliest acts of family violence in the country's history. Newspapers called it a slaughter, and the community struggled to understand how a father and grandfather could unleash such destruction on his own blood. The Newland murders highlighted a theme that runs through many family annihilations: hidden anger, festering for years until it erupts in catastrophic violence. And just a decade later, Germany would face its own family massacre, one carried out not with a shotgun, but with the hands of a man who killed his wife and children before taking his own life. Erfurt Family Murders, Erfurt, Germany, March 2002. The Beale family lived in a modest home on the outskirts of the city. Neighbors described them as private but ordinary. Andreas and his wife Karin, raising 3 children in what seemed like a stable household. But behind the closed doors of that home, Andreas was sinking deeper into despair. He had lost his job, his finances were crumbling, and his marriage was under growing strain. Those who knew him later said he hid it well. No one expected what was coming. On a quiet morning, Andreas snapped. He strangled his wife first, silencing her before she could cry out. Then he moved through the house to his children's bedrooms. Each was murdered as they slept, never given the chance to run or fight back. When it was over, Andreas took his own life, leaving the house silent. 5 lives extinguished in a matter of minutes. The discovery shocked Erfurt. Police called it one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. Neighbors stood outside the home in disbelief, struggling to understand how a man who had once smiled and waved to them could wipe out his entire family. Some described him as kind. Others admitted they sensed something withdrawn, bottled up, but never imagined he was capable of such violence. Investigators concluded that Andreas had planned the massacre. It wasn't an explosion of rage, but a calculated decision. He left behind notes describing feelings of hopelessness, paranoia, and the belief that death was the only way out. In his mind, he convinced himself that taking his family with him was an act of mercy. To the outside world, it was an annihilation. Children robbed of futures, a mother taken in silence, a bloodline erased by the very person meant to protect them. The Erfurt murders never gained international notoriety like Amityville or Chris Watts, but in Germany, they became a haunting example of what experts call family annihilation. Murders born not from greed or revenge, but from desperation, control, and a warped sense of finality. The case fueled national discussions about mental health and the hidden struggles many families keep behind closed doors. The floors are scrubbed, the walls are painted. New families move in, trying to make a home where nightmares once lived. But the echoes don't leave. The memories sit in the silence, unseen but never gone. Behind every smiling photo of the victims is a story cut short. Behind every police report is a family tree shattered in a single night. These crimes remind us of a truth most people don't want to face. Sometimes the greatest threat isn't a stranger in the dark. It's someone sitting at the same dinner table. The violence ends, the headlines fade, but the betrayal remains. And for the families who carry it, There is no rebuilding, only scars.